Got it.
Right, here we go. So today's topic is, why do Christians feel so persecuted? This was a question. What's that?
That's because you told me.
Oh, you knew this because I told you.
Yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about this before. When did we talk about this? I think it was in the spring. It may have been when we were talking about Christian pacifism. I don't know. We've talked about this a little bit before, and I mentioned that I feel like a lot of the reason why we have so much trouble, especially in America today, with people who assume that their religion is being persecuted because they don't have all the dominance that they used to have and things like that. We've talked a little bit about that, and we'll kind of review some of those things that I've said before in this class. But today I want to. Today we're actually going to talk more about history and sociology and literature, actually, than and philosophy, than about this particular question, because I think it's going to kind of help us to come to a conclusion about why. This is a different kind of question. Normally we ask questions that are about what is this, but today we're asking why. So we kind of already assume that this is the case. Christians often feel persecuted. Why is that? So I think that's it's going to be an interesting question for us to discuss today. So in addition to the assumption that the question itself brings, that Christians do feel persecuted, I want to start out just by talking a little bit about persecution and what it is, because I think that there's some confusion out there among the general Christian population in the United States about what actually counts as persecution. So what is persecution? Persecution is the act of harassing, oppressing, or committing violence against a person or group because their differences are perceived as a threat to the community and its continued existence. So when someone is being persecuted, that is different than some of the other types of social violence that are done against a group or against a person. When a group or person is being harassed, oppressed, or have violence committed against them because of something else, not because of their differences being a threat to the community, but for some other reason, then it doesn't count as persecution, at least not in terms of that identity. So if you are being attacked because you wear a purple hat, then you and your purple hat wearing club are being persecuted. But that just because you wear a purple hat and you also wear polka dotted shoes, if you are attacked because of your purple hat, you can't claim that people who wear the polka dotted shoes are also persecuted. So you have to kind of hone in on the why of the harassment, oppression, or violence when we're talking about persecution. And of course, there are lots of different kinds of persecution. A group can be persecuted because of their religious positioning and faith. They can be persecuted because of their racial identity, because of their sexual identity, all kinds of different reasons why people might be persecuted. But it always has to do with the differences that those people are expressing in their identities that they choose to express seems in some way to be a. That was weird.
Yeah.
Was I gone long?
No.
Okay. Well, keep on going here. So they are a threat. They are seen as a threat to the continued existence of the status quo, so to speak. So let's get our presentation back up here. There we go.
There we go.
All right. So That's what persecution is. What persecution is not is disagreement over a practice or a belief. If you practice a different brand of Christianity than other people do, if you don't agree with another Christian about how you should live out your Christian faith, that is not persecution when you disagree with one another. Some people think that it is. Stop persecuting me. You're telling me that my particular kind of faith is irrelevant and bizarre, and so I need you to stop persecuting me. Persecution is also not at play when a government agency applies the law to you in the same way that they apply it to everyone else. A lot of times we hear from Christians in the United States that they feel like they're being persecuted because the same laws that apply to everybody else are being applied to them. You can't have this particular job because you're not vaccinated against COVID-19 is a relevant recent example. A lot of people were claiming that their religious faith was being persecuted because they were choosing not to take this vaccination. Okay. Also, people just being plain rude. If you are driving down the road and you've got your fish bumper sticker or your I follow Jesus bumper sticker or whatever it is, and somebody cuts you off in traffic, that is not persecution for your Christian faith. It just is not. And a lot of times people claim that when they're, when they experience rudeness in other people. But also, persecution is not the same thing as receiving the side eye or the curious glance when you behave differently in public. So if you are, if your family is out to dinner at a restaurant and you decide that you would like to pray together because that's valuable to you, and you hold hands around the table and you bow your heads and you pray, and some people at the tables around you are kind of looking at you a little bit, they're curious, they're a little bit weirded out by what you're doing because what you're doing is different than what they normally see. That's not persecution. That's actually what we want, really, as Christians, right? We want people to notice that we are doing something different than they are, and we want them to get interested in why we're doing that and ask us questions and build relationships with us so that eventually they can understand why our lives are different than other people's lives and why they look that way. And then maybe they eventually will be interested in joining in with it, with the conversation, and maybe even becoming Christians themselves. So, the side eye or the curious glances or the questions, not persecution. So any questions about that before we jump in today? I've got some heavy stuff to share with you as usual today.
Nope.
All right, let's do it. So what I'm going to talk to you about at first may not seem like it is directly related to persecution, but stick with me. And what I'm hoping is that this will help us as we move toward coming back around to this question of why do Christians feel so persecuted? So what I want to talk to you about today is a French professor of language and literature who had a PhD in history. His name was René Girard. And he started out by studying fictional texts, and he developed a theory to understand the origin of violence and how it is related to religion. And his theory is called Memetic Theory. And memetic or mimesis has to do with imitation. So I'll just use the word imitation because there's really no reason for us to use these fancy words that we don't use in real life. So imitation. Gerard said that humans have desires. That's kind of a basic part of what it means to be human. And other humans learn from other humans. We mimic one another. We transfer information and abilities and skills through imitation. We acquire those skills from others. We appropriate their ideas, their skills, their desires. And when we imitate one another's desires, we end up developing a rivalry with the person that we are imitating. Because if they have a desire for something, and then we see them desiring that something, we say, oh, well, if that person desires that something, then clearly that something is worth desiring. And so maybe I should desire it too. But now there are two people who are desiring the same thing. So then there's a conflict. And the conflict begins because they have that matching desire. And that conflict can escalate into aggression and eventually even violence very quickly, because when one person sees another person attempting to acquire something, then that person who's observing will also begin to desire that object and attempt to acquire it. Our mimicry of each other, which is a core part of our identity as social animals, means that we are going to kind of almost automatically have that response to seeing someone want something. The most basic of examples to illustrate this is when you see two children playing. Both of them are sitting on the floor, they're playing with their toys, they're totally fine. And there is a toy that nobody's playing with that's sitting, just a few feet away from them, and it's completely ignored. Nobody cares about it until all of a sudden one of the children sees that toy and decides that they want to play with it. So they get up and they either start crawling or toddling or walking or whatever it is that they can do over to get that toy. The other child looks up, sees that first child going for that toy, sees the desire that this person clearly has to possess that toy, and then instantly, what does that child do? Now I want it too. And so we go from total peace, nobody even cares about that toy, to fighting over that toy in what seemed like an instant. So this is what Gerard is talking about here, that you have this imitative impulse, and then you have the imitation of others' desires, which leads to conflict and eventually violence. And so Gerard says that the source of all violence among humans is desire, is this impulse to imitate others and then therefore to imitate their desires. So any questions about that? That's kind of a lot confusing.
No.
Good. All right. So I want to use a little chart to kind of help you understand this next part. This is an important element of this process that Gerard lays out. So what happens is we've got the two actors, and in Gerard's theory, the person who kind of initiates the action is called the mediator. And then the person who sees that action, sees that desire and decides to imitate it is called the disciple. And the disciple is just the follower, right? The person who sees somebody doing something and decides to imitate them. And so he creates this triangle where we've got the mediator at one corner, the disciple at another corner, and then the object of desire at the top. So the mediator, the first actor, finds some object to desire. And so he begins to attempt to acquire it. Maybe he even already has acquired it. The disciple sees the mediator wanting this thing or even having this thing and also wants to acquire it. So now we have conflict, right? We've got two different actors, both who want the same object. They are desiring the same thing. And the reason why this happens is not because of anything to do with the object itself. The object itself does not have any innate characteristics that make it desirable. What makes it desirable at the end of the day is the fact that it is desired by someone else, at least as far as the disciple is concerned. And even though the mediator originally desired the object for its own inherent value, now that the disciple wants it, the mediator kind of goes in the same direction. And so now both of them, even though the mediator started it, both of them now desire the object, not necessarily because of the object itself, but because somebody else wants it. And so now there's a conflict, now there's a problem. But the mediator and the disciple have an issue now, because their process of attempting to gain this object of desire is making them have negative emotions. It's making them feel jealous and angry and frustrated and threatened. And so in their minds, they have to think about, where is this coming from? And the first thing that they do is they say, well, my anger and frustration cannot be coming from the object of my desire, because I desire it and therefore it is good, it is valuable. And so I cannot, it can't be coming from there. And so they have to shift their attention away from the object of desire in an attempt to fix this problem that they're having in their minds. Why am I feeling negative emotions even though I'm working toward finding this object of my desire? Well, the problem isn't the object, the problem is this other person. But the problem there now is that this conflict between the mediator and the disciple is not going to resolve those negative feelings, because now I'm looking at this, my opposite, I'm looking at my rival here, and I'm thinking to myself, so this rival wants the same thing that I want, and so they must be good. They must be smart. They must, know what's right and wrong. They must have good taste because they want the same thing as me. And so it's almost like they're looking into a mirror and they're seeing themselves in this other person. And so they have a really hard time putting all of those negative emotions onto that other actor. So now they can't put their negative emotions, they can't blame their negative emotions on the object, because that's something that's good, that's something that they want. They can't put their negative emotions, they can't blame them on the other person, because that other person is good, is pursuing something of value. If it wasn't of value, why would I be pursuing it? And so now what do? We're having this problem of not knowing how to resolve these negative emotions. And so what happens is the negative emotions end up starting to turn back onto the person, and the person ends up feeling hatred for actually himself subconsciously, which is a very dangerous thing to feel. That is not a good way to live, and it's hard for us psychologically to balance that. And so then they immediately try to push it back out, and it creates this cycle where the feelings intensify bigger and bigger and bigger, until you get to a point where physical violence might explode into the situation. The rivals, just erupt into attacking one another, either verbally or even physically. But that kind of thing is not good for a community, whether that community is made up of only 2 people, or if it's made up of groups of people, or if it's made up of lots of different types of groups of people. If you want your society, your community to survive and thrive, you have to find some way to mediate this kind of situation, because this happens all the time, constantly within our social world. And so what you do in this situation is you have to find a way to deflect that destructive energy that's been building in you and in that relationship. And so you have to figure out how to deflect it away. You can't put it onto the other actor. You can't put it onto the object of your desire. So you need to find a fourth thing, a fourth party to focus that violent energy toward. And what Gerard calls this fourth party is the scapegoat. And so Gerard comes up with this scapegoat mechanism, this theory of the scapegoat as the means for mitigating violence in a community. And then what Gerard says is that this model of the scapegoat is then repeated over and over within a community and becomes kind of inherently part of what it means to be a human in the community. And you can see this at play in all the great novels, but you also see it at play in the mythologies and cultures of the religions around the world. He says all archaic religion is founded on this. So we're going to get into that part in a minute, but what questions do you have about this part? I know it's kind of confusing. I hope my chart helped a little bit.
No, it's very helpful.
Okay. You good, Karen?
Yeah. It makes sense, and it must be just a basic human characteristic.
Yes.
To want what somebody else has.
Yes.
Because, like you said, you see it in babies and everything, and they don't even know.
Yep. That's what Gerard says. He says that because we are inherently imitators of one another, we will imitate each other's desires. And as soon as you imitate the desire of someone else, then they become not only the model for your desire, but also your enemy. And how do you balance that? You know, how do you deal with the fact that you are looking up to and emulating this person, but you also hate this person because they want the same thing as you? And so it immediately creates a conflict internally, which then comes out and threatens the balance of the community. And so the community had to come up with some way to fix this because it was happening constantly. And so that's where then the scapegoat mechanism comes into play.
Yeah.
All right.
But it's even important enough that it was one of the 10 commandments. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's things, I mean.
Yep.
Good grief. Well, so then how do we overcome jealousy and greed and those things?
Well, we're going to talk about that. Thank you for asking.
Okay.
So, as Gerard moves forward through this process, he says that this is that's step one. You get to this point of violence, and then you need something to kind of deflect your violent energy onto, which is the scapegoat. And so Gerard says that ritual serves to counter the violence because you have cooperation in the community in which the entire community, almost as an impulse, almost as a natural turning together against this scapegoat. They work together to persecute the scapegoat, to put all of that negativity, all of that violence, all of those conflicted feelings of how do I deal with the fact that I am, wanting the same thing that this person has, and I look up to this person, but I'm also so angry with them right now. How do I can't deal with all of this conflict in my psyche. And so I push that out onto the scapegoat. And it's a community thing. The community as one is doing this together, not even thinking about it. It's all subconscious. It's all, instinctual response that the people, even as a whole, as a body together will do to alleviate their discomfort because of all the complex and conflicting feelings that they have going on in this rivalry that they're experiencing. One of the actors sees the possibility for directing the violence outside of themselves, of their community, whether that community is just two people that are arguing or whether that community is larger. So another example from childhood is, you've got the two kids that are playing together and they get into this fight over the toy. Well, then mom comes in and she starts yelling at the kids because now they're fighting over this toy. And what's the first thing that the kid does? they point to the other sibling that's on the other side of the room minding their own business and come up with something that they did wrong. That happened to me constantly when I was growing up. My mom and my sister would get into these big fights, and I would just be like in my room reading a book. I was always in my room reading a book, and I would hear my sister go, "But Katie, blah, blah, blah," like something completely unrelated to the fight that they're having. But she's trying to deflect. She's trying to put that attention, that negative energy that both of them are experiencing on somebody else. She wants to scapegoat me so that I can absorb all of that frustration and anger that the two of them are feeling toward one another. And this is just, again, a natural human impulse. And so the scapegoat is a really important element for the continued existence of a community. Without the scapegoat mechanism, your community is going to fall apart, because we've got these human instinctual impulses that we can't control, but we find a mechanism to, kind of alleviate the pressure. It's a kind of a pressure valve, so to speak, for the community. But the scapegoat is always a particular type of figure. The scapegoat is arbitrarily chosen. The scapegoat is not connected in any way to the conflict. Like I was not connected to the conflicts that my parents had, but they are usually someone who is connected to the community, but on the margins of the community. So someone who is not essential to who the community is, but is at least connected enough that it could be plausible that this conflict could be their fault. Because what is essential to the scapegoat mechanism is that the scapegoat be guilty. And so you have to be able to believe that whatever this conflict is that's happening is the fault of this scapegoat. And so usually it's someone that's marginalized, someone that is on the edges of the society, but is connected just enough that it's believable that they could be the ones that are at fault here. And so you take all of those violent feelings, all that arousal of anger and pain and frustration and confusion, and you deflect it against the scapegoat. And doing that saves the community from being ripped apart from the inside because of this internal conflict. And so then what happens is over time, we actually end up ritualizing this scapegoat mechanism in a variety of different ways. We have religions that develop, pagan religions, where there's human sacrifice built into the system. We do this so that we can purge those conflicted feelings. We do this so that all of the members of the community show their support for the violent solution that they've come up with. We are violent people. We fight all the time. We want to live in community together, but we just can't because of this, imitative impulse that we have and how that leads to conflict and rivalry. And so the solution is to find somebody to blame that is on the periphery. And if we can all agree that this person is to blame, is the one to blame, and then we can get rid of that person, we can purge that person. In purging that person, we are also purging that negativity and that conflict and that violence from our community, and therefore save the community from self-destruction. But it only works if the community genuinely believes in the guilt of the scapegoat. Because if the violence is not received deservedly on the scapegoat, then it doesn't work. You can't purge, you can't deflect, you can't dissolve the violence and the conflict in a way that doesn't seem fair, because then you still have all of those cognitive dissonances, you still have all of those conflicted feelings going on. What you're trying to do is kind of solve things, smooth things over. And so you deflect all of those violent tendencies that would be vented on the members of your community onto this scapegoat, onto this sacrificial victim, so that all of those different elements of dissension that you have in your community can be at least temporarily eliminated by the sacrifice of that victim.
Now, aren't we judging in that then?
Yes, we are.
We're not supposed to judge.
Well, so what I'm talking to you about right now is like ancient pagan religions.
Repeat that.
What I'm talking to you about right now is the development of religion. So this is a description of ancient pagan religions. So this is the religions of the Greeks. This is the religions of the Mayans. This is the religion of, all of the kind of pre-Judaism, pre-Christianity. So
this is BC.
Yes.
Before Christ. Okay.
So this is, this is the pattern that we see, though. This is the pattern that Gerard found in all of the different societies that he studied in anthropology. He discovered that this same pattern was happening over and over and over. And how that ritual sacrifice was made, how that scapegoat was disposed of, was different depending on the society that he looked at. But all of the elements were the same. All the pattern was there. And so what he sees is that the stories, the mythologies that kind of grow up around these experiences that the people have over the course of generations can all be read through this same lens, through this same mechanism. You repeat it as a ritual over and over and over, and these stories turn into myths. And then the myths build gods. And typically, the first victim, within the stories that people tell each other, the first victim is some kind of god. But within the system, of the mythology, the victim cannot be innocent. You have to render the victim guilty so that you can justify that violence that you're doing against it. And so however you do that, which is always going to look a little different, you must do that. That is an essential element to this working out. So an example of this that we are a little bit more familiar with than many others, the Jews, the ancient early Israelites, I wouldn't even call them Jews yet, had a structure for this. They knew that human life was too valuable to sacrifice and use as scapegoats. And so instead, they used animals. And it doesn't make any sense, logically, for the violence in your community to be purged by putting the blame on an animal, because an animal can't cause all of that conflict. An animal can't cause all of that cognitive dissonance and all that confusion and complexity that you're feeling in terms of the love and hate that you're experiencing for this person or for this group of people. But what they do in the rituals of the Israelites is they have that ceremony where all of that guilt, all of that pain, all of that anger, all of that frustration is ritually and symbolically transferred to the animal. And then what do? They literally purge that animal from the community. They shun it. They send it out into the wilderness. They hurl it down a hill. They throw rocks at it. They kill all of those impulses that they have transferred onto that animal. And so that is the process by which then the community can kind of hit the restart button and allow all of those psychological dissonances to kind of dispel and alleviate themselves so that we can continue to live in a community together and not allow all this to keep on building and building and building until the whole thing explodes and we lose our society. So do we understand what Gerard's trying to say here? Violence comes from desires that we imitate in each other and the rivalry that develops. Religion comes in and acts as the antidote to that violence by creating a mechanism that we can use to transfer those violent feelings from each other onto this sacrificial victim that we then call the scapegoat and purge from our midst. Does that all make sense to everybody?
Yes.
All right. So Gerard says, mankind is a species that can always destroy itself. For this reason, it created religion. He says that, you know, religion is the pressure valve. Religion is there to help us to stay in community with each other so that we don't end up just destroying everything that we have come up with here because of these conflicts that we've got going on. When our rivalries are ordered properly, society can flourish. So the rivalry itself isn't what's bad. He uses the example of a ship. So you have a ship, and all of the different sailors, all the different men that work on the ship all have their own role. They all have their own job that they're supposed to do. And their desire matches one another. They see each other desiring success. And so then they'll imitate one another, and they will desire success too. And so they'll kind of compete with one another to see who is the best sailor. I'm doing the best job that I possibly can at what I'm doing. I'm working hard to get better at my job so that I can match up to, if not exceed, the abilities and skills of my fellow sailors. And so by doing that, their society flourishes. They have a successful voyage because everybody's working hard toward the same goal, which is to be the best that they can be. But when that same desire, when that desire to be the best kind of grows past its ability to control it and keep it in check, it turns into a frenzy. So instead of competing with one another over who's going to be the best sailor by doing the job the best, they end up competing with one another about who can be the best sailor by fighting with each other, by starting to get violent with one another. And it's at this point that the society crumbles. And so if that happens on the ship, you're not going to have a successful voyage. Your ship is going to sink, or you're going to end up in the wrong port, or something like that, because people aren't doing their jobs anymore. They've allowed the desire itself and the rivalry to overwhelm that goal of reaching that desire. So sorry, go ahead, Jim.
Didn't the Army have the saying, be all that you can be, join the Army?
Right. That's what that does. It helps you to see that desire in others, to be all that you can be, and then share that desire, imitate that desire so that you'll join. But then you have to have structures in place so that you can control those impulses and direct them appropriately and limit them appropriately so that they don't end up turning into violent rivalry and the destruction of the community. And so what the ritual does, what the scapegoat does, is it helps us to realign the societal rivalries, to reconnect its members as one, so that this social crisis can be resolved. So when you get to the point where instead of being able to compete by being your best, you're competing by beating each other up, that's the moment when you have this social crisis, and you've got to have a ritual in place that will help you to reconnect everyone, to kind of forgive each other, let bygones be bygones, and move on, so that you don't lose your society entirely. And so you take all of those violent tendencies, you collect all of them together, and then you push all of that collective violence against that substitute victim so that the violent impulses can subside. but you also band the group together in this action so that they're kind of working together, they're seeing themselves as one unit, and that helps to reset the social scales, so to speak. And it works as long as you don't think too much about the guilt of that scapegoat and about the humanity of that scapegoat, if it is human. The guilt of the scapegoat is essential, like I said before. You have to figure out a way to convince everybody in a convincing enough way that the scapegoat is guilty of whatever is causing this conflict that you're experiencing as a community. But there's a problem with all of this.
Mm-hmm.
If you are the society that is in charge, if you're part of the group that's in charge, then you get to choose who the scapegoat is each time. And like Gerard says, it isn't an intentional choice, it's a spontaneous choice, but it's usually the same kind of people, the marginalized, the weak. And so over time, you end up having the same types of people, the same groups of people being the scapegoats. So if you are the scapegoat, then this system is not going to work for you. When a group is constantly being scapegoated, they have to figure out how to have a relationship with this process, because the scapegoat process is not going to help them when they have been on the receiving end of all of this violence that they know is wrong. And so they have to figure out how they're going to function, because they have the same impulses that everybody else has. They have the same desires for violence because of their, imitative desire as everybody else. So what do? So Gerard says that it is actually the Jewish experience in history that destroys the scapegoat mechanism over the course of time as it develops from Judaism and then further into Christianity. Gerard is a very faithful Christian, and so he believes that Christianity is the pinnacle of this development. So Judeo-Christianity is the reversal of this scapegoat mechanism, because for Gerard, the crux of the experience, that whole thing that I described to you, the hinge of that whole thing is the moment that the entire community has decided that, yes, this is our scapegoat. This scapegoat is definitely guilty, and we are going to act on our purging decision. It is the moment of the action that is required in order for this to work. But if somebody points out the injustice of the mechanism, if somebody says, this person didn't do anything wrong, why are you choosing them to blame for this? Then it no longer will work to keep the community intact, to provide that pressure valve on the social crisis that the community is experiencing, because it will no longer be logical for them. It will no longer allow them to kind of take all of those complex feelings and place them outside of themselves onto that scapegoat, because now the scapegoat, there's question, there's not certainty that that scapegoat is deserving of that. And so we lose the ability to use that victim blaming kind of system. And that's what Judaism does, because they are always the victim, right? They're almost always the scapegoat in their stories. And so they know that this process doesn't work and it's not just. So I want to share with you an example from the Bible that kind of shows us this, gives us some proof for how this is actually, Gerard is correct, I think, in some way. So this is from Deuteronomy chapter 17, and this is verses 5 through 7. So this is about punishments for idolatry. says, then you shall bring out to your gates that man or that woman who has committed the crime of idolatry, and you shall stone the man or woman to death. On the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses, the death sentence shall be executed. A person must not be put to death on the evidence of only 1 witness. The hands of the witnesses shall be the first raised against the person to execute the death penalty, and afterward the hands of all the people. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. So you can see here that there is definitely some community conflict, psychological and anthropological and sociological conflict with this whole process. So what do we do when there's a threat in the community? We have to figure out who's to blame so that we can purge our community of this threat. And in this particular case, the threat is idolatry. And idolatry is not a threat when one individual is doing it. Idolatry is a threat when other people start to imitate that idolatry, right? Because then it starts to spread and then you lose your connection to God that is appropriate, and you start to fall into other ways of doing things. But what do they require in order for this scapegoating process to take place? This is not something that can be done from an Israelite context using impulse and kind of the natural flow of people's feelings. There are stops in place that help you to challenge that impulse for imitation, to challenge that mob mentality, that thinking like with your feelings and not being individuals. The personal responsibility is on the witnesses, on the people who start this whole thing. So you can't just say, oh yes, I saw that person doing that. Think about this versus, for example, the witch hunts in Salem. You have to have at least 2 witnesses.
Real bad.
Oh, am I breaking up now? Man,
Yeah.
I wonder what's going on with my internet today. Is it any better at all now or no?
It sounds like it.
Okay.
Keep talking.
Okay. Let me know if it goes away again. Think about the witch hunts and compare that to this. In the witch hunts, one person could get up all up in a frenzy and point to someone and say, I saw her doing something that she wasn't supposed to do. She's clearly a witch. And just on that alone, the whole community responds, and now that person is the scapegoat for that community's worry over, what is happening in their society. Well, this person is to blame because she's a witch and we're experiencing a drought. So clearly she's to blame for this drought that we're having. We're going to kill her. But here, you can't just do that. You have to have at least 2 witnesses. And most importantly, the witnesses themselves have to be the ones to execute the death penalty. They have to be the first ones to throw the stone. Well, that sounds kind of familiar to us, doesn't it? Throwing the first stone. Why is throwing the first stone important for this particular law? I think we'll find out about that by looking at something from the New Testament. So, questions about the first passage or comments before we talk about this one? Nothing?
Nothing.
Okay. So this first stone thing, throwing the first stone thing, is familiar to us because there's a whole story about it with Jesus in the Gospel of John. So I couldn't fit this whole story, so I just put up some of the important pieces up on the screen, but I'm going to read you the whole story. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and making her stand before all of them, they said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" They said this to test him so that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And once again, he bent down and wrote on the ground. When they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the elders. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, sir." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way, and from now on, do not sin again." So what Gerard says about this passage is super fascinating, because he says that we imitate out of compulsion, out of impulse, instinctually. We don't even think about the way that we're imitating someone. We imitate others' behaviors automatically and unconsciously. What everybody around us is already doing is the easiest thing to do. And so he says, it is easy to join a violent process already started. To start this process oneself is an entirely different proposition. So what's happening in this story and what's happening in that law that is a little bit less obvious is that Jesus is pointing out the illusion of the guilty scapegoat. He mentions the first stone. He mentions that in order for the group to go from having this social crisis to purging that social crisis, somebody has to act. You can't just continue to only imitate one another. You have to have that moment where you actually act. And like I said, that for Gerard is the crux of the matter. You can have all the stuff happening before it, but until you get to the moment where you act against the scapegoat, the problem is not going to be resolved. The only way to solve the problem is to act against the scapegoat. And so somebody has to be the first one. They have to throw the stone. As soon as one person does it, then the whole group can do it. The avalanche begins, the floodgates open, and the resolution can come to a conclusion. But until that first stone is thrown, there is danger, because somebody might notice that what they're doing is an illusion. What they're doing is wrong. What they're doing is not just. And so the last obstacle between peace and justice and right behavior that stands between us and losing all of that in favor of violence and injustice and falling victim to our lesser instincts is that act, that one person choosing to do that. And so when Jesus says, "Throw the first stone," I dare you to be the person who makes that unjust choice. I know that it's really easy for you to just participate in the violence, participate in this mob of grabbing this woman and bringing her here before me. But who here wants to be that first person? None of you do. All of you want to just imitate the next guy. And so I know that. And so I'm going to tell you that. I'm going to point that out. I'm going to point out the illusion of guilt in this woman. She's not any more guilty than the rest of you are. So how dare you, is what he's basically saying here. And I dare you to claim that. And none of them can do it because he's broken the illusion. It's too late.
Okay.
So this is a problem for society. It's not a problem that we see because, we kind of have been indoctrinated into these ideas that human life is valuable and that we should never, kill somebody else in this kind of way, etc. But Gerard says, from the point of view of the state, Christianity is a force of anarchy, which is kind of funny because we just talked about anarchism last week.
Yeah.
But what Gerard says is that this process of taking all of that conflict and all of that violence and all of that internal turmoil and struggle and placing it outside of the community onto a scapegoat, that is the only way for a society to function and to continue to exist. Without that, your society crumbles. And so as far as the state is concerned, as far as society is concerned, as far as structural organized community is concerned, Christianity is an enemy, because Christianity is in the business of pointing out those inconsistencies, pointing out those illusions, pointing out that that moment of solution is not actually the solution that you think it is. And so then Gerard says, in any society, if one intervenes in favor of a unanimously condemned victim, one must expect in the end to become a scapegoat oneself. And this is ultimately what happens to Jesus in the crucifixion. So when we threaten the state by pointing out to the people who are using these functions to maintain their state that it's wrong, that it's never the solution that they think it is, that behaving in this way is violence for the sake of violence, violence for the sake of, cleaning one's own conscience versus actual justice. As soon as we point that out as Christians, we become enemies of the state, because not only are we pointing out that that behavior is wrong, we are taking away from them the very means by which they continue to exist. And because of that, they're gonna destroy us. They're gonna try to respond to that and squash that. They're gonna end up scapegoating the person who dares to stand up in that way. So what questions do we have about this? Because now I'm going to start to transition into actually talking about persecution among Christians. Finally.
I'm thinking about protests and they can start out peaceful, but they almost always have a leader. And I think they have to have a leader.
Yep.
And they can turn violent in a heartbeat.
Yes.
And how does that relate to this, in the fact that well, they have a scapegoat, but the mob has a scapegoat. But do we make the mob our scapegoat then?
So there are a lot of different things going on when it comes to protest. The two sides of a protest, the protesters and then the police officers, they don't come in imitating one another. They have two different desires. The protesters have the desire of getting their message across, and then the police have the desire of keeping the peace and making sure that nobody breaks the law. But then when they encounter one another, they see that the desire that they have are in conflict with one another, and then they start to desire something else, which is to beat the other side. It's not exactly the same thing as the original intention. The original desire is to have their voices heard or to make sure the peace is kept. But once they encounter one another, then it becomes a competition. I desire to beat you. I desire to have my desire met before your desire is met, over your desire being met. And as soon as that happens, then we're into Gerard's process. They both have the same desire to beat each other. And then it becomes violent. It becomes that rivalry. And as soon as one person decides that they're going to act on that violence, they hurl the first stone, so to speak, and then everybody else imitates what everybody else is doing. And that's how physical violence erupts in those kind of situations. But then when the protest is over, the whole process happens again on a larger scale, because now we have a societal issue. The whole community of the United States sees the report on this on World News Tonight and sees how this happened. And then they have to decide, how are we going to solve this community crisis that we're experiencing? We're arguing with one another over what's happening here and what's right and what's wrong. And in order to resolve that, we have to find somebody to blame. And almost always, it's easiest to blame the protesters. We can find some reason why they were wrong. They're the ones who started the violence against the cops. They're the ones who, you know, were complaining about something that's not even a problem in our society, or whatever that justification is for why we want to make the protesters the scapegoat to resolve that community-wide crisis that we're having. We make that so that we can continue to function as a society. Because if we don't, then those things will continue to broil under the surface and eventually explode, and the whole community, the whole society will dissolve. So, I mean, Gerard, he's not universally loved and accepted, but he's a smart guy. He knows what's going on. All right, so let's now talk a little bit about how this all translates into this question about Christians feeling persecuted. So we have this process of imitation that we want to learn. We learn what is desirable from others. And what we end up doing is we actually end up finding a new desire, which is the desire for that victim status. When we look at our scripture and we see that Jesus is on the side of the victim, that Jesus is pointing out the injustice and the illusion and the bottom line wrongness of these behaviors in the society that has the power, then people who desire to be morally upright, people who desire to have either literal or figurative power over other people because of their position, their prestige, their reputation, they actually start to claim that victim status because they see the value of being a victim that can benefit their desires, their causes, their reputations. So by finding ways to claim victimhood for yourself, you are actually leveraging the benefits, so to speak, of being a victim that the Bible tells us victims have. Oh, well, I'm a victim, and so I have God on my side. I'm a victim, and so Jesus loves me more than he loves you. I'm a victim, and so nothing I do is wrong in the same way that what you do is wrong. So what we do is we end up taking these ideas about, that are right, about how we should be like Jesus, we should sacrifice ourselves. And instead of using that in a meaningful way that kind of aligns with what God intends for it, we actually turn it around, and instead of using it as a way for us to purge our power, we end up using it as a way to build our power. We have to find ways to interpret our lives as blameless victims, like Jesus was a blameless victim, instead of doing what needs to be done and accepting the consequences of the ways that what we do threaten the status quo in our society. We talked about this last week a little bit when we were talking about when Jesus washed the disciples' feet, that we kind of assume that Peter is upset by that because it's threatening to Jesus and his status. It's humiliating to him. But what's actually happening there potentially is that Peter himself feels humiliated by Jesus' actions. If you're the one on the floor and I follow you, I'm your disciple, then what does that make me? It's kind of the same thing here. Are we washing people's feet because we want to purge our power? Or are we washing people's feet because we're using that as a tool to get what we desire? And because we see other people desiring power and control, we imitate that and use the tools that we have, including victim status, to gain that. I want to bring to you just one verse from 2 Timothy, which is not a book that we tend to focus a lot of attention on, but it's an important example of this, I think. It says, "Indeed, all who want to live a godly life in Jesus Christ will be persecuted." So how do people interpret this? What does this mean?
Is that the same as we're not of this world, we have to be separate? Because we believe in Jesus, we're not going to be accepted by the mainstream.
So that, I think that's what it's supposed to mean. I think it is a statement of political fact. If you want to live a godly life, if you are working toward living a godly life, people are going to see that and they're not going to like it. And so you're going to end up getting persecuted. And it's not because you want to get persecuted. It's not because, what you're doing is wrong. It's because it's the reality of the world we live in. If you want to live this way, if you want to point out the ways that the community and the ways the society and the ways that the government are wronging people and doing things that are not in God's eyes the right thing to do, then you are going to get hurt. That is just the political reality and political fact of the matter. But what people do in modern Christianity is they read this and they say, well, if I'm not being persecuted, then clearly I am not a godly person. I must be persecuted in order to be seen as godly. Or if I'm not being persecuted, then I have to find ways to interpret myself as being persecuted so that I can claim that I am a godly person, so that I can get that desire, which is to, be that person of God, that to please God, to be able to claim that identity as a true and meaningful follower of Jesus. And so what they're doing is they're taking a statement of political fact. If I'm going to try to live a godly life, then that's just going to be the conclusion. And they're kind of turning it on its head. Instead of saying, if I behave in this way, then bad things are going to happen to me. And instead they say, if bad things happen to me, that means that I'm a good person. And if bad things aren't happening to them, then that means that they're not a good person. And so they desperately need something bad to happen to them so that they can feel like they're a good person. And so then they start to try to interpret everything around them as persecution. You cut me off in traffic and I've got that fish sticker on the back of my car. You clearly did that because I'm a Christian and you're trying to persecute me. All of it. And so I think that is where we start to see Gerard kind of feeding into and helping us to understand a little bit about this persecution complex thing. Because Christianity is on the side of the scapegoat. And if we want to be on the side of the scapegoat, we have to find a way to be the scapegoat, even if we're not, even if we are part of that major society, even if we're part of the mob that is attacking the scapegoat. And in fact, sometimes, many times, what we end up doing is we end up victimizing other people in the name of the victim. We claim that we are supporting the victim and we're helping the victim, but we even end up scapegoating the victim themselves. We're claiming that we're speaking for a victim, but we end up actually re-victimizing the victim because what we're trying to do is not help that person. What we're trying to do is use that person's victimization to gain our own desires.
Complex.
So, yes. So coming back around, Why do Christians feel so persecuted? Well, we know from our scriptures and from our experience of God that God is on the side of victims. Scripture is written from the perspective of victims. Our tradition challenges the scapegoat mechanism. And like we said, when you challenge the scapegoat mechanism in a society, the society is not going to like it. The government is not going to like it. And so the more you fight against the scapegoat mechanism, the more you are going to be persecuted, the more you are going to be attacked, the more you are going to be scapegoated. Pointing out the injustices of the process to prevent that imitation from moving forward results in attack from the society that is looking for ways to reset its own stability. And so when we say that God is on the side of victims, when we live like God is on the side of victims, we are actually a threat to the secular world that we're living in. And the people who wrote our scriptures were in the same position. They write to provide a different framework for social stability, a different way of purging those social crises and those violences from our societies, because the scapegoat mechanism doesn't work. And they know that because they've been through it so many times as Jews and then as Christians in our scriptures. So when we read from the orientation of a victim as Christians. And so we kind of set ourselves up to feel like we are persecuted, to feel like you have to be persecuted in order to be a Christian, because it's a necessary part of being in the people of God. But the problem with that is, of course, for the last several thousand years, Christians have not been the persecuted ones. They have not been the scapegoats. They have been the ones in power. They've been the ones who are maintaining that state that is of benefit to them. But now we are finally in the modern world getting to a point where that's not as much the case anymore. Christendom as a concept is dying off. I read an article just this past week or two ago that talked about how if trends continue, by the year 2050, Christianity will no longer be the majority religion in America. Under 50% of Americans will claim Christianity as their religious position. But it's not just now, as Christendom declines, that this concept of feeling persecuted is coming into play. I think we've used religious language to justify our actions and choices forever. And even when Christianity was dominant in the Middle Ages and throughout all that time that Christendom kind of existed in Britain and Europe. But religion always helps us to justify our violent tendencies and desires, right? That's what Gerards said. The purpose of religion is to help us to justify our violence and to fix our violence so that we can maintain our societies. And so Christianity itself, even though it originated as a contradiction, as an antidote to this idea of religion as the fix for violence, Christianity has been manipulated and used over the course of time to actually perpetuate the very violence and justification of injustice that Jesus was fighting against. Why? Because we're human beings and that's what we do. Gerard says that we all imitate, we all continue to do the same things that other people around us are doing. So when we see other societies benefiting from the manipulation of their religion to maintain their status quo that's of benefit to them, to control the population, then of course we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to do it from within our own context. But that doesn't mean that we're Christians. That means that we are members of the Christendom society that's looking to dominate and control and gain power. So what I want to bring to you kind of as we conclude this today, because we didn't really, come to any kind of meaningful learnings or anything in terms of what we should do, is I think we need to be aware of those things. And I think we need to kind of keep our focus on what's important. So our wrap-up verse for today is from Zephaniah, another Bible passage or Bible book that is not commonly used. Zephaniah chapter 2, verse 9 says, "At that time, I will change the speech of the people to a pure speech, that all of them may call on the name of the Lord and serve him with one accord." So there is an alternative to the scapegoat mechanism for our conflicts and our violence. And that is to help ourselves and help each other to remember the ultimate desire that we share. We do imitate each other's desires, but it's not a conflict because we are working together toward the same goal of calling on the name of the Lord and serving him with one accord. And if that is the ultimate desire that we all have, then we can work on that together, not in competition with one another, not as rivals, but as partners. And yeah, there will be other conflicts, there will be other desires that get in the way. But if we can keep this in mind, then that will help us to prevent things from getting out of hand and turning into the mob mentality that we've seen so many times in so many different instances throughout history, whether it's in, between two people or between entire countries, like when we're thinking about the Nazis and the Germans and their societal crisis that they blamed on the Jews and tried to, use the Jews to purge their conflict and anger out of their society. So that is what I have for today.
Good.
That was good.
It's what?
Questions? Comments? Disagreements?
It's always so much to think about. It takes me a while to work through it.
That's all right. You can always email me if you have questions or comments later.
Okay.
Next week, I'm having cataract surgery
Oh, okay.
on Tuesday. So I don't know how available I'll be.
All right. Well, if you're just sitting around with your eye patches over your eyes, then maybe Barb can get you hooked up and you can lay and listen to us.
Yeah, see what happens.
All right. Well, blessings on that and prayers for safe procedure.
Thank you.
Hope you both take care of yourselves.
Thank you.
See you next week.
Okay, thank you, Katie. See you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.